Jeff Hecht. Welcome to the Tailwind Podcast.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me.
So you're a prolific and accomplished science writer, and we're here to talk about your 2019 book entitled Lasers, Death Rays, and the Long, Strange Quest for the Ultimate Weapon. What prompted you to write this book?
Well, I had written a book called Beam Weapons that was on the editor's desk when Ronald Reagan gave his Star Wars speech. So I was more or less ahead of the wave at that point. And of course, having written that, I followed laser weapons because I write about lasers. And what's been happening in the last 10 years or so is that a new technology has been developed for solid-state high-energy lasers that is much more efficient than anything previously available. The early lasers that were being used for testing the idea of laser weapons were, in particular, very inefficient. So you might get 1% of the energy you put into it out in a laser beam. And they were not at wavelengths that worked very well to get through the atmosphere. You only get a certain amount of wavelengths through the atmosphere. If you looked outside my window right now, you'd see we've got smoke right now, for example, in the air.
Right.
There are certain wavelengths that don't go through the air well. So, yeah, a laser was a neat thing, but you really needed to have the right laser technology. That laser technology was developed for industrial machining, cutting and machining. Once that got in, it was, the way I called it was, the giggle factor was gone. It wasn't ridiculous science fiction-y to try to speak about laser weapons. It is, well, let's see what we can do with this and see if we can do anything good, or anything useful militarily. And right now, there's a lot of high-power lasers being tested, and we're finding out that it looks most attractive in relatively short distances, so you don't have to go through a lot of air, and at objects that are damaged by heat. So something like a kind of a drone sort of thing you'd be shooting at, or missiles that are coming at you from a short distance. And the laser advantage is that essentially if you've got laser and the laser is powered by electricity, and somewhere on the battlefield you've got some kind of generator. So you can keep shooting as long as you've got whatever you're powering the generator with, instead of running out of rockets after, I'm all out of here. My 10 rocket battery is all gone. I can't shoot anymore. So that's the rational, so there's a rational reason for doing some of this technology. It's not, the giggle factor is gone. And there's some enemy out there that you want to worry about.
Right. So I would say, from reading your book, the story of laser weapons or directed energy weapons, I would say, is one of a lot of false summits, going back really to the early 1920s. In other words, a lot of times where a lot of very smart engineers came together and said, okay, now is the time. There's been some new sort of underlying technology that now it enables us to do this. Let's try it. But at least as far as when your book was published in 2019, it did not seem like anyone had fulfilled the vision of a laser weapon that we might see in science fiction or something like that. Is that fair to say?
We're trying to design something that will work, not something that is a lot more reasonable to work. Some of the early death rays were simply people like Nikola Tesla, for example, who was a very gifted engineer and physicist, but he didn't really understand modern physics. He understood classical physics, but not modern physics. And something like lasers are an outgrowth of modern physics. They're an outgrowth of quantum mechanics.
Right. So that I was going to start with Tesla. So Tesla, he was developing wireless power for commercial uses, and then World War I breaks out. How does World War I, and in particular the advent of military planes, catalyze research for a sort of death ray weapon?
Well, all of a sudden, with airplanes flying around overhead, They can come around, they can find where your troops are or where the enemy's troops are, and you don't want the enemy to know where your troops are. And then once they started flying overhead, well, we can drop things on the troops, and that's a real threat to anybody on the land. So you want some way to shoot these things down. They tried shooting rockets at that stage. Nothing really worked. So they were trying to find something that they could use to blast planes out of the sky. And I mean, Tesla was fairly competent at some things, but there were some people who were early radio people, and they just were working on radio, see if we can get enough power up there, see if we can get somebody to pay us money for trying to get enough weapons out there. And a lot of these things were kind of dodgy. And there were a few that were more or less just faked.
Right. So there's one figure in particular, a guy named Harry Matthews, who starts sort of pitching this idea for a death ray weapon, and ultimately, I think, sort of convinces the British military to sort of, I think, help finance his development of it. And then it doesn't work out. They feel a little bit burned,
yeah,
right?
That's a good summary of it. They call him Death Ray Matthews. And he was a character. He had been an inventor and level of radio equipment, and early worked in radio in, I think, South Africa back in the very end of the 1800s, 1899 or so, when they were experimenting with, that was a very early age of radio, that was just trying things out. So that was it. Tesla actually sold the Soviet Union plans for making something that they never could get to work.
Right. When I mentioned earlier that there were some sort of false summits, I sort of think of Harry Matthews as kind of one of the early main kind of false summits that starts that trend a little bit. One of the sort of anecdotes that stuck out to me, so after the Harry Matthews saga, the British military, then they created this rule around sheep, right? What was that rule?
That rule was you had to be able to kill a sheep at something like, let's say 100 feet or 100 yards. I can't remember exactly which. But in other words, you had to not just warm something up, you had to do something. And they decided killing a sheep was an adequate demonstration of doing what they wanted to do. Now, maybe that wasn't actually the right thing to use. You might just have wanted something that would knock out the electronics in a radio electronics in an airplane. But in any way, it was a clever way of looking at it. It was also a way of saying, we were burned, we're not going to be a sucker again.
Right. So fast forward to World War II, there's still demand for a death ray weapon. But then essentially after the nuclear bombs are dropped, I think that the military sort of says, hey, we've got these nuclear bombs now. These are the ultimate weapon. We can rely on these instead of having to try really hard to develop these death rays. Is that fair?
That was where they were in 1945, pretty much. And what changed this all was the intercontinental ballistic missile. And all of a sudden we realized, wait a minute, they're way over there, but they can drop a missile on top of us. And of course, we were trying to do the same thing on them. And then Sputnik came along and said, oh, you can launch something that can go around the way of Earth. And then they can drop something on us. So that was a capability that scared Dwight Eisenhower and all military all the way down, really. And they started looking for new technology. They established the first version of what it was the Advanced Research and Development Project Agency. It's now DARPA. And DARPA started looking around for ways of missile defense. And as it happened, the concept of the laser was just emerging at this point. Charles Towns had developed it. There was some work in Russia. They were still formulating it. And Towns was at Columbia University, and there was a grad student named Gordon Gould who was working in the same department. And he had been working at some other interesting technology. And Towns came and pumped Gould on the idea that he was using, which was called optical pumping. that it turned out, yeah, that could, at least in theory, be a way to pump a laser, to energize a laser. And so Gould was asking Towns in return what he was thinking of. And, well, Gould got fascinated by the idea and more or less went home and, with a bunch of books, worked out the concept of how to build a laser. He was got ahead of Towns. And then he had always wanted to be an inventor, so he decided to try to patent it. And he needed money to work, to live while he's trying to make this patent. So he ended up going out to an early aerospace company called TRG. And he was doing this on the side. And then the company decided, hey, we could get a military contract for this. And they went and they walked down to DARPA and got, I think it was $999,000. In other words, they were just short of $1 million, which was one of the key. So they didn't have to go through another hoop in getting money. And $1 million was a lot of money there. And then they discovered that Gordon Gould had been a communist and had gotten tossed out of that Manhattan Project, as a matter of fact. So he was a very bright guy, but they wouldn't clear him to work on the project. But this was where the idea came from, and while it got didn't work very well at the beginning, the first lasers were being developed at this time by somebody else. Gould's group was able to replicate the first laser very quickly. And that, of course, was validation of the concept. And they're starting to look at how to do this. And that led to development of the first, what was eventually the first laser weapon, the Airborne Laser Laboratory, which was a big, I call it a rocket engine laser, but it's a big laser that's burning chemical fuels to generate energy. And it was flying around in an old 707. And it took a long time to get to shoot anything down.
Yeah, so how effective was it? What were its sort of limitations in terms of its usefulness in a military setting? And then what were the sort of engineering, maybe hurdles that resulted in those limitations?
The Airborne Laser Laboratory was emitting infrared light that kind of got through the air, but not very well. And it wasn't emitting a lot of power, and it was vibrating like anything. It's a big old rattly airplane, and that meant it was very hard to point it at anything. So what they learned from the Airborne Laser Laboratory was, we've got to find a better laser, more efficient laser. We've got to find one that goes through the air better. And we've got to have some way of pointing the laser and controlling the vibrations and things like that. There was a whole long list of things that were more or less blocking doing anything useful with the laser, with the Airborne Laser Lab. And just about at that point, they came to that point, Reagan Star Wars came along. And, okay, hey, if you can get they wanted to put a big laser battle station up in space. And they had ideas for another chemical laser, which is sort of like a rocket engine, but you're having beams of light, and then you would be shooting them at Russian missiles up over the atmosphere. And that literally never got off the ground. And there was an attempt to make an X-ray laser, and that didn't work. And it really was they were really kind of seemed to be more interested in scaring the Soviets than actually doing anything. But it became that kind of military strategy game.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Reagan gives this speech sort of now known as the Star Wars speech, where he basically says the military should use the same sort of intellect and organizational abilities that they use to develop nuclear weapons. They should now use those same abilities to develop something that is sort of an antidote to nuclear weapons. And I don't think he mentioned necessarily death ray weapons, but it seemed like that's what the sort of military and scientific community ran with after it.
This was more or less, let's try everything we can think of and see what looks best. And they did,
Right.
So they did,
Right.
Filtered out the most promising looking ideas. There were others that came out of this. When they were doing the laser work, the orbiting laser battle station really just had too many things that could go wrong with it. It was just not easy to do. We were remember this, at that time, we'd gone to the moon, we were starting working on the space station, and we're starting to learn what can go wrong with the space station type of thing. Right. So that was it, and then Soviet Union went out of business, and that changed who we had to worry about.
Exactly, yeah. So again, another sort of fit and start for the degree of military interest in developing weapons like these. Then, as you mentioned, as we turn into the 21st century, there's a shift to solid-state lasers. So why were solid-state lasers considered such a game changer?
One of the important things here was that you needed power. You needed lots of power. And when you were using these rocket engine lasers, you were not getting much power. You're generating a tremendous amount of power, but not much of it is going out in the laser beam. And when you're running a big rocket engine type of system in an airplane, as there was in the airborne laser, which was a beast of the 1990s that was continued on and finally more or less wiped out, that was tested and shot some things down, but not really convincingly in the early 2000s. So when that was looked at and decided it was a failure, although they'll never admit it, they really wanted a better technology. And what you had, the technology that had been developed for industrial lasers. In fact, they were looking at a whole lot of other technologies, but what's developed for solid-state lasers that turned out to be most effective is actually based on fiber optics. You're having optical fibers inside this structure, and that controls the light very well. And you can start out with a semiconductor laser, which you can generate turn 50% of the energy into light with. That's technology used in solid-state lighting, or fundamentally the same technology. But with the lasers, you could get a little higher efficiency. And then that ended up being able to scale better than a big block of solid glass laser. They could do, I think they did 50 kilowatts continuous wave. That was a lot, or 100 kilowatts. That was a lot of power. And you could do it steadily, meaning for a matter of let's say minutes, rather than just shoot a single laser pulse. Now, there may be other reasons for wanting to shoot laser pulses, because you're trying to find a way to damage a surface. And if you ping with a big flash of laser, you might damage something. You might drill a hole through it that might be more destructive for whatever you're trying to kill than it would be with you just having a hot laser beam continuously at it. It's just what basically you're looking for kill mechanisms. And the actually relatively long, steady beam of seconds, minutes seem to be pretty good. And you're looking at trying to more or less burn a hole, for example, in a rocket. And it's got a sheet of aluminum on it. If you would build a hole in it, it's flying through the air. That would probably cause it to go somewhere other than you thought it would go, because that just would disrupt the flight. So very simple. Now, that's all very simple-minded, of course. There's an awful lot of complexity in this. And people like Lockheed has been working on this for 15 years now, really.
Yeah, that was my takeaway. It seemed like there's all these different trade-offs, and there could be different sort of military use cases where making a certain trade-off still sort of makes the laser weapon effective in the battlefield. Like you mentioned, if you just want to heat up the outside of something, a long ray that it doesn't need to necessarily puncture it right away. You're just trying to heat something up, particularly if it's static, it's not moving. But do you think science fiction, movies, books, has that created maybe an unrealistic expectation of how these types of weapons will work, at least in the eyes of the public?
Yes, because they think of Luke Skywalker and his, which is really a continuous wave visible laser, technically, and it's not. It actually doesn't work anything like a laser, and that's where going back to the 40s and 50s, Buck Rogers, and when I wrote my beam weapons book, I did little calculations of how you would generate so much heat, and then you'd end up. Buck Rogers would have to have asbestos gloves because there would be so much waste heat to shoot that kind of gun. But that's the way people think because they've seen it in the movies. And yeah, it's really a whole different thing. I mean, right now, what seems to be the most effective target, or the target most vulnerable, I should say, is a short-range missile. This is what, when you're looking at the Iron Dome that Israel has, or Trump's Golden Dome, which is actually something different. Some of those are just shooting actually rockets. But the real advantage of a laser weapon, be able to shoot more pulses of light than you could fire rockets at the bad guys. That's your basic trade-off, and it also costs less. And if you're dealing with a real-world situation that is not end of the world sort of thing, but just people who are shooting at you more often than you like, you really want to have a large battery of able to shoot a lot of rounds at whoever you're shooting at.
Right. And I guess it begs the question, what we see in movies like Star Wars, are those types of weapons, are they theoretically possible for us to develop one day? Or have we sort of found in trying to develop these directed at energy weapons that sort of level of effectiveness, I guess, just violates the laws of physics?
In a lot of ways, the Buck Rogers handgun sort of thing is pretty much violating the laws of physics in the sense that you're going to have to produce a lot of waste heat. You've got to go through the atmosphere, and you don't really want to go through a lot of atmosphere. And this, of course, is also typically Buck Rogers is, in my recollection, was shooting at somebody or shooting at something pretty close to them, where it's a different thing than shooting at rockets, somebody else's rockets. They're moving. You can plot their trajectory, but you have to lock on it and keep going on it and watching where it's going. So there's a lot of that requires a pretty complex tracking system. So you don't really have that in a handgun. Things don't come that way. And what you're doing is really looking at taking something that is going through the air, is fairly close to you. I mean, this is why Israel is particularly interested in it. If you've got something that is coming from a few kilometers away, that's much easier, and it's also not moving real fast. It's just a little more realistic target. And this is really what our government is working on laser weapons. It's more or less battlefield type or local limited scale war. What they're talking about in the long distance area of this, in the Golden Dome, to the extent that we really know what's going on, it appears to be a concept that was cooked up by Lowell Wood and Edward Teller at Livermore called Brilliant Pebbles. And you would be based on putting little space stations up there, up in a low Earth orbit, that could spot somebody's rockets being launched. A long-distance rocket goes up out of the atmosphere, which makes it a good target. You can't see it very well, but it still is a good target. And you can track that for a ways as long as it's not actively changing its course. And that's kind of what they're talking about. Now, that's really not easy to do. And Brilliant Pebbles was more or less laughed off the stage in the 1990s. and it was just something we didn't need. But that is the concept that they think might work. I don't know that it will work. There's a lot of complexity to really doing it, and putting anything up in low or Earth orbit means they've got to keep launching more of them, like the Starlink satellites. And you've just got to keep replacing them every few months or years. So there's a lot of complexity in this.
Yeah, there is. There was a notion, I think, with the attempted development of the airborne laser, which ultimately was not sort of successful in meeting its initial goal. But some of the folks involved, ultimately said, okay, we didn't achieve the initial goal, but we learned a ton. And it will sort of facilitate the future development of weapons like these. So I guess, do you think that the military is just through these programs, even if they're not necessarily successful each time, are we inching closer to what the vision was for these types of weapons?
Yeah, you're learning what works and what you can do. You may find that you need a lot of different capabilities for different types of situations. And they may say, okay, well, we can't do this. This is not good for, let's just say, fighter guns shooting at each other with laser beams. Airborne fighters. No, that doesn't really look realistic. But you're learning what kind of material you can use, what kind of material you can't use. Sometimes you need to know what the enemy can't really do, although they may think they can. There's a lot of games of building weapon systems and then countermeasures to shoot down those particular systems, and then countermeasures that would that would allow the weapon to get through. And you can imagine how far that level of measures and countermeasures can go. There's always, one of the things the military has learned is to have a lot of more or less lessons learned on file. Okay, you can't do this. It will blow up before it gets off the ground. In the early days of the space age, there were the satellites that were being used for surveillance, and they were secret, and that was part of it. But we had tried to launch something like 10 or 11 of them before we finally got one in orbit. And then it proved tremendously useful in telling us what the Russians really had and preventing the Cuban Missile Crisis from going boom. These things that take a while sometimes can be, you learn important lessons. You can also learn that, that you may not just be able to do it. That's, another thing. Or you can't do it with, let's say, a rocket engine laser. That may not work. It also, when you're firing something like that, firing the laser keeps re-steering the whole way the laser plane is going and how the output beam goes.
Yeah, that was one of the trade-offs, I guess, that stuck with me the most, was even if you're shooting from a stationary laser, essentially, but it's firing a beam at something, the longer the beam is it has to be focused on the target, the more the laser apparatus is going to vibrate a little bit and move around, and the accuracy, therefore, is going to decline over time. So if it takes 30 seconds to heat up the target, you might be on target for, the first, I'm making up numbers, for the first 20 seconds, but then the accuracy declines. So it's just, there are all these little trade-offs that it seemed like sort of were revealed over the decades as the military was exploring these technologies.
Oh, yes. And one of the other examples of that, as the laser beam goes through the air absorbs some of the laser energy. It heats up. When it heats up, it expands, and it's making a negative lens that's spreading the laser beam out over a larger area. And this is thermal blooming. And it's one of those things, because once they started seeing it, yeah, I see that from my physics books. This is, this would happen. Yes. Oh, hell. But, you learn these things. And there's all these things that are complex that, a typical Air Force pilot wouldn't have a clue about. That's not his department to learn of, but that's what happens. So there's a lot of things we learn, and certainly one of the things they've learned, there are certain wavelengths you just don't try because the air absorbs those wavelengths.
Yeah. Since coming out with the book in 2019, I would say really right around that time, the private investment community, particularly the sort of early stage venture capital community, started to get really interested in what has sort of since been termed as defense tech. Since that time, over the last 6 years since the book came out, have you seen, maybe related to that interest from the private investment community, have you seen a renewed sense of optimism or at least interest in developing these technologies?
I'm not sure because I'm trying to think through my knowledge of who's in the military, the high energy laser business. And I keep up with Lockheed. And there was one of the very hot laser companies for a while, IPG Photonics, was in the fiber laser technology, was really an originator of the high power machining tool. But because their founder and their roots were in Russia, they're now back in the United States, they were being very careful to limit their involvement with it, where they were a hot company. And, I don't know how, I think they actually more or less bootstrapped because I don't follow the financial things. But there certainly have been some, I know there were some things, but I'm not sure whatever happened to them. I don't follow the investment world a lot. It's not something like fiber optics, which I was watching the fiber optic boom when, it eventually came and collapsed. And there was a tremendous amount of investment in that case, but it was over optimistic investment. And it was partly because MCI WorldCom was fudging their numbers, I think. But it's a different kind of thing, and most of the companies involved are the big aerospace firms. And if you're looking at building up investments, you're trying to start something up that would have a higher return based on your investment than you would from yours. And, Lockheed is a known company. It's worth X billion dollars. You're not going to multiply that as much as you might want to.
You wrote a book called City of Lights, which is about the fiber optic revolution, in particular, sort of the application of fiber optic technologies to enable better telecommunications. And there was one part of it that really stuck with me because as an investor, when we're trying to figure out which technology is going to win out in a certain market, we'll go talk to a bunch of engineers and experts and try to get their take on what they're using and where they think the industry is going. And I always think back to City of Lights because there was a time when everyone thought the future that telecommunications was going to be enabled by microwave waveguides. And instead of having fiber optics strewn about everywhere, underground and on telephone wire poles, it was going to be these microwave waveguides. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's an innovation, I believe out of Corning Glassworks in England, that enables sort of the manufacturing of fiber optics at scale. And so it was just a reminder to me that we should talk to experts and do the research, but you always have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because you never know what some really smart person in some corner of the world is working on that is going to disrupt what the sort of expected technology is going to be.
Well, what happened was that fiber optics came out of nowhere from the standpoint of the communications world. They thought they were going to be sending light beams through the air. And then, and Bell Labs took one of their first lasers up to the roof and were sending things down through the air to another part of one of their plants in New Jersey. And didn't work very well. Flickered a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just red light trying to go through laser beam. It doesn't work all that well. And fiber optics for communications came from ITT, well, it was the old International Telephone and Telegraph Company's branch in England. And some very innovative people, very smart people. Charles Cowell was the
Yeah.
effectively the leader of that group. And he had a boss who was one of the inventors of a major radar for during World War II, who was a very bright and innovative. But fiber optics came through, and it worked. It was one of those things that people tried, and it happened that Corning had developed a very clear form of glass, not just for transparency, but for the fact that it could withstand high heat.
Yeah.
It's the stuff that makes Corning wear. So what you've got is, here is technology that comes along, and somebody's found a new way to use the new technology. And that you have on the other side of the game with this microwave system, you have the old monolithic single company that runs the world in telephone. Right. And they had started planning this thing probably in the 1940s, and by the 1950s, they had all set it up, and they were planning the future on a 20 or 30 year, 20, 30, 40 years. And fiber optics came and hit them like a truck.
Yeah.
Where they just weren't looking for that. And what happened is that optics, glass technology, and the laser, that combination of lasers and fiber optics, changed the world the same way that semiconductors turned electronics. You're probably not old enough to know much about vacuum tubes, old vacuum tube radios, but it's a different world. Yeah. And that is the kind of thing that is very hard to predict, because some of these things, Corning's technology came out of Corning's philosophy of developing new glass to solve new problems. And the fact that they have had in Bob Maurer, a guy who understood very, very well what made glass clear. And a bunch of guys who worked with him and got this technology up and running. So you've got a technology that nobody really tried to work this way before. And nobody had the tools to work this way before. And the same way with fiber optics, they've been drawing threads of fiber optics since Daniel Colladone in 1840. But now they've found a way to do it, and a way to do it well, and it's something that needs it. So you kind of have to look for a place where a number of things will fall together. If we had fiber optics, if we hadn't had lasers, if we hadn't had semiconductors, we'd probably be pretty much in that old handheld phone on the wall, wired to the wall, because that technology was there from 1900 into the, let's say, 1980s.
Yeah, it really is. It's an incredible story of disruption, and to your point, about Corning, sort of an underdog story, and just how quickly technology moves when it's truly superior to the status quo. And so, yeah, it's something I just, as an investor, I always keep in mind, that there's there could be something out there lurking that just a small team at a certain company anywhere in the world, if they can fit the pieces together, can be very disruptive very quickly.
You want to be the right people in the right place at the right time. You may have to work with the right people. I mean, Corning and ITT worked together. Corning was sending people out looking for ideas. That was when Corning is one of the companies that has made an awful lot out of a technology like glass.
Yeah.
And you've got to get the right connections. There were 5 independent inventions of the fiber optic imaging bundle, which was an early part of the story. It's not a huge story, but there were 5 independent inventions of a technology. They were different in detail, but they didn't take off earlier for various reasons. The first one was that the guy was a Jew in Germany, and it was 1930s, and it was time to get out of there. The second was the guy was really a radio engineer, and he had other things to do. And then you had a couple of, a guy in a garage, more or less, inventor. And, you had a couple other people who were working in optical fibers. So it just takes a while for these things to hit because somebody's got to need it. And
Yeah.
you've got to have something else that, if if you didn't have a way to have a cable, you couldn't have undersea. In the early days of undersea cables, you had to have a cable that wouldn't leak and connect. And you had to have that cable to make that technology work. It's a very, very complex business. And, you're just kind of looking around there, and sometimes things will all come together. And, and by and large, in, electronics and communications, that all just came together 1950 to 1980 or so. Then just all, it all worked.
Yeah. And to bring it back to death ray weapons, I would say it was interesting reading your two books because City of Lights is a story of where all those different technological pieces did come together. And then with death ray weapons, it's sort of like the pieces haven't quite come together yet. There's still some missing pieces and we still have ways to go.
Yeah. And that's the same thing. And there are ideas that never work or that something other comes along and works. I mean, the microwave technology, I think some of that may still, there was some of it that was being used for I guess the one link of that hollow pipe used was for a radio telescope somewhere. Someone found a use for it, but there aren't always uses. Doing something like laser weapons, doing very high technology that's very demanding, is hard to do and has to be done carefully and right. It may take you a lot of false starts before you get to something that works. And you can't guarantee anything is going to work. It's just, that you'll get better and better at it, and whether you'll actually get off the ground will depend on what kind of, if you were talking about airplanes, what kind of technology you have to get off the ground and stay in the ground and not come back, crashing back down. So it's a lot of work.
Yeah. Jeff Hecht, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was great chatting with you today.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Great talking with you. Good questions.